Welcome to China Manufacturing Decoded from Southeast, the podcast where we take you through some of the major topics facing importers and manufacturers in China today. Hi there, listener. Thanks for joining Southeast for episode 21 of our podcast. I'm Adrian, and today I'm speaking to our CEO, Renaud, about manufacturing contracts. These are so important when it comes to protecting yourself when you're dealing with Chinese or Asian suppliers. We're going to be talking about what the benefits are of manufacturing contracts, what actually goes into a manufacturing contract. Is it just about manufacturing, or does it cover IP protection and other things like this too? And we'll touch on what happens if you are going to litigate in China. Let's get into that. Hi Renaud, thanks for joining me today. After having read a blog post on China Law Blog recently about suing Chinese manufacturers who have produced products which are the wrong quality, this got me thinking a little bit about how we can avoid this kind of situation, and actually about the kinds of manufacturing contracts and other legal apparatus that you can actually use to protect yourselves when you're working with Chinese manufacturers. So, is it the case, Renaud, that you find a lot of foreign buyers actually end up dealing with a Chinese manufacturer without a manufacturing contract that protects them at all?
Hi. So yes, a lot of them are in this situation, and this is often a mark of an inexperienced importer, or it is the mark of an importer that has experience but has taken a lot of other precautions, and that doesn't think it would be very helpful. But in many cases, it's the mark of an inexperienced importer. And every time I say, well, how about the contract? A lot of people would say, well, contract with the Chinese, it's not even worth the paper it's written on, and you cannot really enforce it, and so on. And the reality is yes and no, but there's substantial benefits actually in sitting down and drafting a contract and getting to a written agreement with them, and we can get into that later today. Yeah.
Okay. And is there one thing that you think, or maybe more than one thing, that can cause buyers to feel secure enough that they don't even bother with a contract, and they're almost sort of falling into a trap?
Well, look, some of them feel they're secure because they don't really know about their risks. And imagine a company in the middle of the USA who's been dealing with local, in-country counterparts. Do they need to have a contract every time? Maybe not, especially if a lot of the transactions are a few $1,000s, right? You're not going to involve lawyers for these kinds of things. And if something wrong happens, you can still sue the other party. There's a lot of, implied agreements, right? When you start to deal with a Chinese supplier or a Vietnamese supplier or an Indonesian supplier or whatnot, first the amounts tend to be higher because there are minimum order quantities, because you want to fill up the container, the amounts tend to be higher. You might not ever have been in the situation where you've had issues with such a counterpart in another country where, you don't really know how to handle that. You don't even know if a contract can do anything for you at all. So you don't even think actually of setting up a contract, right? And I've seen that many times, and I can understand that. Well, if you're buying, $3,000 of socks, do you really need a contract? I mean, there's a lot of things you can do. For example, in Alibaba, they have that trade assurance thing that is definitely not protective if you have relatively large amounts of money at stake. But again, if it's $3,000 of socks, what, or 5,000 or even 10,000, why not do it? It's relatively inexpensive. It does reduce the risks, and there's many ways to mitigate your risks in these cases. I mean, keep the amounts small, so there's a lower incentive for the other party to cheat you, and also there's a lower exposure on your side, a lower exposure to risk. I guess that's it's pretty simple to grasp. If, on the other hand, you tend to purchase large amounts, well, you might, for example, work only with suppliers that offer you very good payment terms, and that can help you mitigate the risk. For example, I remember, wow, uh, 16, 17 years ago now, I was helping an importer. I worked there for some time, and they were buying only from suppliers that accept letters of credit at 60 days, back in the day at that time. And needless to say, not all suppliers wanted to do that. But then they would say, hey, we'll give you a PO, at least $100,000, sometimes $150,000 to $200,000, and we keep things relatively simple. And here's the specs, here's everything. It's very clear, and the quality standard is not very high, but you gotta accept that kind of payment terms. Well, that's pretty protective. I mean, if you find some issues, the letter of credit pretty much always allows the buyer to put the payment on hold and to just cancel everything, right? So that was very protective. And some buyers also find that they are very attractive to certain suppliers, and they can negotiate to pay after receiving the goods, or maybe they pay 20% down and then 80% after receiving the goods. Anyway, it means the supplier is not going to play games, right? So these are examples. Okay, there's other things I could mention, but these are examples where the buyer feels like, hey, I'm fine. I'm sort of covered. If something goes wrong, I will get my money back, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you're able to keep some financial leverage over your supplier in China or Southeast Asia or wherever they are, of course, this is going to be a really, really good way to control their behavior to a certain extent in terms of getting what you want as the buyer. If we talk more about a manufacturing contract as kind of like a legal tool to gain this result over your supplier, I mean, what do you see as the benefits of this kind of contract if we're not talking about, using a letter of credit or something like that and using payment as the tool? How about a contract itself?
Well, the number one benefit by far is to put on paper, what happens if this happens, what happens if you are late by 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month, 2 months? What happens if you want to raise your price? Can you do it right away? Can you do it without any form of justification? What happens if you violate our confidentiality agreement and we have a proof of that? What happens if this, and that? And it sort of forces the supplier, to read through it and confirm in writing, yes, that's fine, we commit to doing that, right? And as a bonus, if you have a clear quality standard that you attach to that agreement, also the supplier will pay more attention to it. They're much more likely to read it carefully because they want to know what they're committing to, right? So that's by far the number one benefit. I guess the second benefit is when things, and if things really go south, the relationship really turns sour and they stop responding and whatever, as the buyer, you still have one weapon to really scare them, to scare the supplier. It gives you some extra leverage. in these cases. And for those people who've been in this situation, I guess, yeah, they wish they had an enforceable contract, right? Enforceable in the country where the supplier has assets, obviously, or or in a country that if they find the supplier guilty, then will make it likely to I don't know the exact legal word, but to transfer that into a Chinese court and get a court order onto the supplier, right? So and it's much more simple if it's all litigated in China and then enforced right away in China. Actually, Chinese courts, from what I read and from the World Bank standards and so on, the World Bank listing, sorry, it seems like agreements are enforceable in China. If you write your contract in a very specific way, if you write your contract in a way that the Chinese court would not find is unfair, there's certain things like this, of course, you got to be careful with. But if you pay attention to all this, if you work with a good lawyer, you can really have something that's enforceable, a pretty good weapon, a loaded gun in case the supplier does something wrong. And they're not used, Chinese suppliers, and most of them anyway, are not used to being sued. So it's sort of a shock for them. So these are the big two benefits, right? Of course, there's some other things, but these are the big two, I think.
Okay, I think that will surprise perhaps some of the listeners who are in the West who perhaps think that enforcing things in China seem like they're almost impossible if you read a lot of the Western news these days. But in fact, it's actually good news.
Yeah, sure. And one thing also, I just thought about that. I forget, because you mentioned manufacturing contracts, but actually there's two other contracts that are really, really important. If you, as the buyer, work on a new product, right? So there's two things: the confidentiality agreement, which, okay, and everything I'm saying here, you get to double check it with a lawyer if you want to use it, right? I'm not a lawyer. So when it comes to confidentiality, you don't want your designs, your files, your samples to go around in an uncontrolled manner. So you want to prevent the supplier from disclosing the information, from using it against you, or or to compete with you, or to sell it to someone who competes with you. And you want to prevent the supplier from maybe reaching out directly to your customers, right? These are some of the important things. Now, if you have them sign on that, they would tend to be more careful. Okay, some of them, of course, we all know them. They don't even read the contract. They say, well, whatever, this is just the paper. If we sign that, we'll get the order. Okay, let's sign the paper, and then the purchaser will feel he's done his job and it's going to be fine, right? So that's a bit dangerous, because they don't intend to do anything about it. But if they come back to you with some suggestions for changes and so on, it is a good sign. And by the way, a lot of our clients at the beginning sent us these kinds of confidentiality agreement, and we have to get back to them and ask them to make some changes, maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30% of the time. Some of them are really very worried. I mean, to the point where they're nearly paranoid, and they want to have these really heavy, damages and things like that. It's really punitive damages that that are not very nice to read in a contract. I mean, it would nearly give them the incentive, to make it look like we breached the contract just to sue us and to finance their project. So anytime we see that, we say, no, forget it. But I kind of understand where they come from. So there's confidentiality agreements, and then there's the development agreement. So if you develop your own product, and either you're going to count on the supplier to bring some of the technology, maybe something they developed before, maybe one of the modules is going to come from them or something like that. Or the supplier is going to do some of the engineering work, right? And who's going to make the tooling, right? If there's, for example, a plastic enclosure, who's going to make the mold? Are you going to manage that from your country and everything? No, probably the supplier is going to handle that. Probably work with a tooling fabricator, or maybe the plastic injection molding shop also makes tooling sometimes. So most of the time, supplier is going to end up managing that, or a consulting firm or engineering firm. I mean, we do that for a number of clients. But in any case, you want these people to sign a contract about development, and it should make it very, very clear who owns the intellectual property, right? If you're going to pay for all this work and it's all based on your ideas, and you're basing maybe your business on that, or you're really investing seriously into it, you definitely have to own the intellectual property, right? So that at one point you want to switch from this supplier to that supplier and so on, and you are in position of power because, again, you financed all of that, right? And this comes back to the previous podcast, I forget which episode, on contract manufacturers and the way they tend to be different from OEM and ODM manufacturers, right? This would typically be easier with a contract manufacturer. There's, of course, there's special cases, and again, I'm not a lawyer. There are, relatively complicated cases where it's what they would call maybe blended intellectual property. And then what happens in this case, you maybe, instead of saying such and such party owns the intellectual property, you might say, well, the manufacturing, only the customer can decide to manufacture this product in this factory, and they end up having this type of agreement where the supplier cannot make it for other companies, and maybe the buyer commits to not having other factories do it, provided the factory hits certain performance standards, or provided they keep complying with the quality standard and don't raise the price without reason, and all. There can be a long list of criteria here to ensure that they can keep manufacturing the product, right? It can get pretty complicated. And yes, Steve Dickinson on the China Law blog wrote several good articles about that. That's easy to read, but really they don't make it more simple than it should be. It does cover a lot of nuance, and so that's what I would suggest you read if you want to know more about that.
I'll try and link to one or two of them in the show notes, and also the podcast episode you were referring to about the different supplier types. I'll definitely add a link to that for any listeners. So far you've discussed the agreement to stop your supplier from using the IP incorrectly. So we're talking about something like an NDA or an NNN agreement, right?
Yeah, a triple N agreement, is what a lot of lawyers call that.
For anyone listening, what do those N's stand for, please?
Oh, non-disclosure, non-use, non-circumvention. So that's what I mentioned before. They should not disclose it. They should not use it for any purpose other than the purpose of the agreement, and they should not try to circumvent the importer, basically.
Okay. And then you moved on to product development. So a kind of product development agreement, and that's who's actually developing the product, who's actually going to be owning the IP when all's said and done. And again, this is an issue depending on the type of supplier that you might work with. And how about when it comes to the manufacturing, so is there such thing as a manufacturing agreement as well?
Sure. I mean, it's a bit like a purchase agreement. I mean, when you think
Mm,
about it, so when you purchase something, what you want to have the supplier commit to, you know, what's the product, what's the spec, basically also what's the quality standard that, usually is maybe in an appendix to the contract so that whenever it's updated, you don't have to reopen the contract and have everybody sign it again. Another thing you want to know is what's the price, right? So when you manufacture with a company and you really have them sort of trained to make your product, you can really switch to another manufacturer very easily. So you want them to offer you, let's say price stability. They should not be able to raise the price, especially without reason, and like for next week, right? So you want something to control that. Now you're not going to be able to tell to have them sign that all throughout 2020 and 2021 the price will remain 12.5 US dollar per product, or even in RMB, which would be low risk for them. Except maybe if you buy, millions of these widgets, yeah, you will find the supplier willing to commit to that. But generally speaking, you can't do that. But at least you can put some limits on unexpected price increases, and you want the
sure.
price to be set right there, and you know don't change it anytime soon, right? Another thing obviously is, when am I going to receive it, right? So typically when you issue a purchase order will say shipment date to be on whatever, 15 November. What happens if they comes 15 November, if they say, well, it's we haven't really, finished assembly yet, we're going to be late, sorry, and then actually they haven't even started assembly, and they ship to you on 15 December. Well, you're not going to be very happy. So you want something, some kind of penalty or something like that really entices them to try hard to be on time, right? And obviously, as the buyer, you want to do your part here. You need to give them enough, maybe some forecasts if possible, maybe non-binding forecast, but with a certain degree of accuracy. That obviously always helps.
Mhm.
Also, don't don't try to squeeze the lead times too much. You need to be reasonable. Otherwise, you're sort of forcing them to be late. And especially if the product has something new that needs to be approved, well, you got to be realistic. You can't tell them, yeah, you have to ship 15 November no matter what. And then maybe you need to get some samples to your own customer that you don't control, and your customer gives you the approval on 8th November. Well, what's going to happen? The factory is going to have to decide, hey, do we go ahead and produce anyway, which in some cases, unfortunately, is, might be the best thing to do. It's actually quite common. Or we wait
Mm,
just to be safe, but then we're going to be hit by the penalties. What do you think is going to take precedence, right? So you need to frame your contract in a way that gives them the right incentives, but also at the same time, you got to be reasonable on your side, right? You need to be reasonable. You might want to negotiate other things, maybe having them keep certain level of safety stock, maybe of some of the components non-assembled, or maybe of finished products. Then that goes into VMI, vendor managed inventory, which they would finance, maybe sometimes in a warehouse just next to your warehouse, but it's still on their book. So you're financing it indirectly, obviously, because that takes warehousing space, that takes working capital, that takes all kinds of things. And then the manufacturing agreement would typically cover a range of other things, but I don't really want to go deep into that because, again, we're not really lawyers, and I don't want to go into
sure, sure.
explanations of arcane clauses and there's a lot of things here that I've read maybe 20 times, but I've never really seen anybody sued for them and defend themselves for them and all these kind of things. So as a non-lawyer, I have a pretty limited understanding, of course.
Sure, that's okay. This is more about giving a structure of, what you would say a typical manufacturing contract is going to be including. So you've got the Chinese NDA or Triple N agreement, you've got the product development agreement, and also the manufacturing agreement. So I mean, all of these together would constitute your typical manufacturing contract as a best practice, and that's what I'm looking for. Nothing
If you're
specifically lawyery.
developing, yeah, if you're developing a new product, I mean, if you go into the Canton Fair, let's say last year, right, pre-pandemic, you went to the Canton Fair and then you saw some nice whatever coffee machines, and you said, "Oh, I like this one. Can you make it in blue?" Okay, great. Well, you're not gonna have the supplier sign a triple N or an NDA, right? I mean, or except maybe don't say that you work with me or something like that. But I mean, it's their own product, so you can't really force them to keep it just for you, except if you say, well, I want exclusive distribution over that territory, and I commit to selling 50,000 pieces of them next year. That might be something the supplier agrees with, but still, it's not going to be your product. I've never seen that, Chinese supplier saying, okay, it's we sell you the IP rights and things like that, and we'll never make it for anybody except you, and it's a bit weird. And same thing for the development. If they all they do is put your logo on it, well, you don't need to have a development agreement, I guess, right? You go straight into the manufacturing agreement. Oh yeah, okay, and you already have the tooling, you already have all the design, everything. You can go into production anytime. Just change the color. Okay, great. What are the payment terms, right? So that's another thing that goes into the manufacturing agreement. Obviously, the payment terms. Where is it going to be made, right? Because you don't really want them to subcontract. You want to be able to visit the place or have somebody audit the place and confirm that, well, it's relatively reliable and they know what they're doing. They have a quality system and things like that. So, okay, this is the approved place. Don't put manufacturing anywhere else, because usually that's a very bad sign, right? That's where a lot of disasters come from. So no subcontracting. Obviously the buyers got the right to go there when there's production, pretty much any time, right? If the buyer finds some issues with, inspection, testing, no shipment, keep it there, fix it, present it for re-inspection, until it's fine. That's very, very standard. And then what happens if it's received? But then there's a lot of quality issues that are noticed. That's where a lot of contracts that I've read really fall short, because lawyers, and it's normal. I mean, it's not something that they're trained to know, but they can't really make the difference between a manufacturing defect and a design defect. Defects can come from different places, and if it's a defect that is due to the design, maybe the product is using the wrong material, but hey, yeah, you say TPE, this is TPE, we did exactly what you said. It's not a manufacturing issue, but if after 1 year in normal use, the TPE gets really damaged, or there's some abrasion or whatever, you can't go back to the supplier and say, hey, the product you made is bad, because maybe the supplier did exactly as you wanted, right? According to your design. So this is really ridiculous. You can't go back to the manufacturer for design related defects. And people really don't understand very often, what they would say, well, it happens sometimes and sometimes doesn't happen. Well, yeah, that really sounds like a design-related defect. You know what? But people don't really understand that, and it's a bit difficult to explain. And so typically, it's really important to make sure that as the manufacturer, they can't come back to us for defects that appear like 12 or 18 months after the products are in the field, because typically these are design-related defects. Typically, manufacturing defects are noticed very early in the life of the product, right? It's something that's poorly assembled, it's poorly glued or whatever, or there's poor contact in the board, or whatever, or the product falls down and it breaks the connection and it no longer works. A lot of these things will come up in the first 1 to 3 months after the products are in the hands of users or in the field, right? But anyway, this is so what happens if a lot of defects are found in the field, right? So first, what does it mean a lot? Is it 50%? Well, that sounds like really a lot, right? On the other hand, is it 1%? Well, debatable. It really depends on the kind of product and usage and price point and everything, right? What happens if there's a lot of issues? Can the manufacturer be sued? On what terms? Why? How can the manufacturing contract be ended, terminated, right? These are some of the common things that are in a manufacturing contract.
Sure.
And pretty much any lawyer that is used to business transactions with Asian suppliers will have this type of template, right? I mentioned Steve Dickinson and the good folks from the China Law blog, but we've seen a number of contracts from a number of different law firms, and they tend to always cover the same things, but really where they differ is in depth. So some of the contracts are 3 pages long. That's a bit short, but if you purchase relatively low quantity, maybe low amount, let's say you place small orders, at least you maximize the chances that the supplier reads it, right? And sometimes less is more, as they say. And at least if there's the 5 key things you want them to know and comply with, maybe that's a good fit. And I don't know if lawyers would agree with that, but that from a business point of view, that makes sense. Now, there's also contracts that are 60 pages long and a bit hard to read and really go into all the details of, and these tend to be very protective of the buyer, but the typical supplier is not capable of reading it and understanding it, right? This works well with relatively mature and experienced suppliers, right? And typically it's for purchasing, to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars at the very least. Don't do that if you find a company on Alibaba to make, I don't know, yoga mats or bamboo kitchen gadgets for $5,000, right? It's not a good fit. They're not going to read it. They're not going to pay attention to it. They're probably not even going to want to sign it. And for good reason. They will say, hey, but why you send us such a crazy contract, right? For this kind of small business. And frankly, they have a point.
What I like about the manufacturing agreement is that it takes away a lot of the ambiguity that you might find. I mean, we spoke recently about how a lack of transparency is fairly evident in China when dealing with Chinese suppliers a lot of the time. And this really sort of keeps them in line, doesn't it?
Right. That's why the number one benefit I mentioned at the beginning of this episode is really to put black and white on paper what is expected, and to have the supplier read it and hopefully comment on it and get to an agreement in a written manner, right? because what I see a lot of the time is people who talk and talk and talk, mention something in Skype, mention something on WeChat, right? But they don't keep all this in a master document. They don't put it all black and white clearly. Well, that might be efficient in the short term, but that's I think an opportunity is lost, basically. Really.
Oh yeah. If there's been a problem in the past, trying to go back through multiple different chats in,
Yeah.
different areas and emails and on WeChat and whatever, I mean, it's a nightmare, isn't it?
Yeah, obviously. And then, well, you know what? The supplier, if you sue them, will also go through your Skype and WeChat and things like that, and they will maybe find contradictory things, or maybe not directly contradictory, but certain things that are how to say inconsistent enough to make you look bad and inconsistent in a court of justice. And this is really not good. It's not good.
Yeah, I'm sure they're fairly impartial, but if they look at it from that there are some inconsistencies that made it very, very difficult, you made it difficult for your supplier because of A, B, and C, then yeah, of course, I suppose it's going to be much harder to ultimately sue them, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think so. I think so.
Regarding suing, and this kind of brings it back to the blog post that I was talking about at the top of this episode as well. When they talked about the outlook of being able to litigate, even if you've got an enforceable contract, and China Law Blog seem to think that it's not really a very good outlook. It's pretty grim actually on how successful it might be, or even the cost of the litigation.
If you have not worked, I think the article you mentioned really starts from the premise that the buyer either did not have a contract or had a contract that called for litigation in another country, and and is only and has a contract that's only in English, and like accumulates the mistakes. And then once you accumulate the mistakes like that, it's just terrible. And there are things that they did not mention, like for example, the payment was sent to another company, right? Or was sent to a personal account, or I mean, people make all kinds of mistakes in the name of expediency and convenience, I guess. But then it means it makes it much harder to hold the supplier accountable, right? And we see that all the time. People don't. I don't know that a lot of people don't pay much attention to all these things. They have the sort of the personal level trust with the supplier, and hey, yeah, it's gonna be fine. It's gonna be fine. They're nice people. Yeah, it's gonna be fine. They have a lot of other, customers in Europe. We're gonna be fine. They look like great people, right? And they don't really look at what's the worst thing that can happen, right? And when the worst happens, well, it's too late. That's basically what it means. So preparation trumps everything else here.
Absolutely. So rather than ending up being in a situation where you've got to litigate, really you need to have put in the groundwork to prevent that situation from occurring to begin with.
Yeah, that's what I would say, definitely.
Excellent. Okay. Well, that's a really sort of a really interesting dive into manufacturing contracts and how to protect yourself when dealing with suppliers in China and Asia. Thanks very much.
Hey, cool. Yeah. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to like and share, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other places that you get your podcasts from. See you next time.